I'm not gonna lie, when I started One Piece as a teenager, Usopp was my least favorite character. He didn't seem as driven and self-assured as Luffy, as strong and determined as Zoro, or even as thoughtful and selfless as Sanji was. Everyone else on the crew seemed so much more capable and so much more worthy of my attention and awe. Nami, for example, is an excellent navigator and a capable combatant, and Chopper, who frankly doesn't get as much shine as he should anymore, is a doctor who has multiple transformations which he's able to do because of his devil fruit, further enhanced by his rumble balls that he invented. Robin is an archaeologist who, comparable to Nami's knowledge of the seas, is our navigator of the deeper narrative of the story, as well as a literal ex-assassin. Frankie is the shipwright, a cyborg, what's cooler than that, and possibly the most affable crew member. Brook is a literal skeleton, our musician, a swordsman, and our crazy old grandpa. Jinbei is a wise and experienced former warlord of the sea. So what could a loser like Usopp contribute to the crew? When I first read One Piece, Usopp represented the worst traits I'd probably want in a shonen character. To me, he was a weakling, he was a coward, and he was a liar. Even his design was pretty goofy. He's always been a somewhat comic relief character, which for me was his saving grace, but I found it difficult to admire him for anything else. In a genre that often highlights the outlandish caricatures of various versions of a hero, Usopp was the zero. I'm sorry, that was kind of corny. But his dream is also the most abstract and intangible out of the crew. While Luffy wants to be the king of the pirates, Zoro wants to be the world's strongest swordsman, Nami wants to draw a map of the world, and Sanji wants to find the all blue. What does it truly mean to be a brave warrior of the sea? The irony, however, is that Usopp, like his dream, is probably the most realistic in a world that is far from grounded in realism. I mean, let's be honest, our main character is a silly rubber boy. There are people who turn into elements, animals, and food. There are giants, fishmen, and mermaids. There are islands in the sky and islands into the sea. Why the hell would I care about some normal guy with a slingshot? What does he have to offer in such a fantastical world? The truth is, he probably has more to offer in terms of growth and potential than anyone else, because the point of his character is to show us how much he can grow. If we look at the One Piece world like a video game, for example, some characters start with some stats that are higher than others. Characters like Luffy, Sanji, and Zoro start with extra health, strength, and defense stats. Nami and Robin with intelligence and special skills. Usopp is the starting character with 0 stats in almost every category. Technically, he is quite smart, but he desperately needs to be leveled up just to keep up and continue fighting with everyone else. Now, why is this? Why is Usopp the underdog? He's a pretty normal guy. He grew up on a peaceful island. He lost his mom when he was younger, and his father, a pirate, was and continues to be absent in his life. Aside from the pirate stuff, Usopp's life is extremely realistic, and that's exactly why he doesn't stand out. It is also why it feels like he's so far behind everyone else. You see, the irony of Usopp is that he may be a storyteller, but he lacks a story. Every other character has been through some serious trauma that affected them in a way that forced them to be a stronger, more capable and independent version of themselves. Unlike every other character, Usopp's journey really begins with his introduction to the story and the crew. Usopp may have grown up, in effect, as an orphan, but the effects of losing his mother and having an absent father only result in his coping mechanisms of lying and storytelling. He really was just that weird kid in the village who watched too much TV or took the fantasy of the books he read way too seriously and spent all his time acting out his imagination as best as he could with the resources he had. Additionally, Usopp grew up without a mentor or mentors. Usopp had no real tangible example of what it meant to be strong, what it meant to be brave, what it meant to be the best, the most powerful, or the most capable. The closest he got to that was the stories his mother told him of his dad. His guidance was purely through his dreams and imagination. He had no tangible scale to judge what it truly meant to be strong or what it meant to be brave. In comparison, and spoiler warnings up to Whole Cake Island arc, every single Straw Hat went through some of the most life-changing, devastating experiences before they became crew members. Luffy, for example, was trained as a child by one of the most powerful Marines, and people for that matter, ever in the world of One Piece, which also happens to be his grandpa. He was also raised by literal mountain bandits while roughing it out in the wilderness and in one of the most dangerous places, the Great Terminal, with his two brothers. He also lost one of these brothers, by the way, in the process. He also had a friendship and mentorship with Shanks, also one of the most powerful individuals in the One Piece universe. Zoro literally grew up in a dojo with the master and a rival, training to become the world's strongest swordsman. He also spent the majority of his time as a bounty hunter to get by. Nami's adoptive mother, Belmare, was a marine who was also super tough in her own right. After Belmare was killed, however, Nami was practically raised and abused by the same fishermen pirates who took her mother's life. She then spent many years as a pirate under that crew, stealing from other pirates in hopes to free her village from their control. Sanji grew up as a prince in one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world with a family that absolutely despised him because his bioengineered genetics failed to kick in. He was trained to become a super soldier, but was practically kicked out of that family, started a new life as a child sea cook, was then shipwrecked for 85 days, and then began another new life under the mentorship of an ex-pirate in the toughest sea restaurant in the world. Chopper was bullied by fellow reindeer for being different, and then after consuming the human food, was bullied further, but then also treated like a freak and a monster by humans for being too reindeer to be human and too human to be reindeer. He then accidentally fed his only father figure a poison mushroom, but received top-notch medical training by one of the best and wisest doctors in the One Piece world. I'm not even going to go into Robin, Frankie, Brook, and Jinbei, because at this point I think it's self-explanatory. The bar in Syrup Village was set very low, and his battle with the Straw Hat Pirates against the Black Cat Pirates was really the first time Usopp had any taste of how dangerous it really is in the real world. And thus, we are truly experiencing Usopp's character building backstory in real time. Usopp is a dreamer, and his journey with the Straw Hats is merely him going out into the world to actively pursue these dreams. He's in the process of transitioning from being a storyteller who makes things up to a writer of his own story, not through dreams and fantastical ambitions, but through hard work and experience. The crazy thing about it is, even the most fantastical features of his imagination pale in comparison to everything that is actually out there. As a result, Usopp still falters and gets scared throughout the story, and sometimes he still runs away. Usopp's fears are legitimate, however, for someone who comes from the background he comes from. One of his lowest points was during Water 7, when his self-confidence was at its lowest, as not only was he dealing with his already pertinent imposter syndrome, but was also faced with the idea of being replaced and being made redundant as a crew member. Usopp has always been hyper-aware of his self-perceived usefulness or uselessness to the crew. Up until that point, he had struggled through all of his fights, some of which he had to be saved from. Even if he wasn't that much of a fighter, at least he had the responsibility of taking care of the Going Merry, taking advantage of his handyman skills. But even in that area, he was no expert. During the previous arc, Long Longland, he helped his 3-person team build the most stable boat for the first event, a race, which they lost, and were on track to permanently losing a crewmate, Chopper, as a result of that loss. As far as he could see, he contributed nothing of substance to the crew. The crew, however, didn't feel that way. Just as we can be our worst critics, Usopp was extremely self-critical, and thus every loss he had only amplified his self-loathing. Coming to Water 7, knowing that they were going to find a new shipwright meant that Usopp would ultimately become even less useful to the crew. He was then robbed by the Frankie family, losing the 200 out of 300 million they needed to repair the Going Merry. He was also unable to retrieve it on his own. When he was finally able to speak to Luffy about it, he was informed that they were just going to get a new ship instead. To Usopp, it felt that if the Merry, which carried them all the way up to this point, could be replaced so easily, why wouldn't he be? Sure, that entire argument was based on miscommunication, but to be fair, that miscommunication itself was a result of everyone in that situation coping with the loss. The crew coming to terms with the loss of Merry, and Usopp coming to terms with the loss of his last ounce of pride. If the Merry, being damaged goods, had been considered dead weight, he'd save them the trouble and leave on his own terms, challenging Luffy to a fight for the ownership of the Merry. Ironically, it is during that fight that Usopp showed how capable he actually was. Usopp is undoubtedly nowhere near as physically strong as Luffy in hand-to-hand combat, but he spent enough time with Luffy to know his weaknesses and fighting style. As a result, he was able to give Luffy one of his toughest fights yet. At a certain point, it even almost looked like Usopp was going to win, however Luffy still bested him. That being said, Syrup Village Usopp would never have the courage to challenge Luffy in a one-on-one fight. Usopp in that moment stood up for himself and what he believed in against his best friend. He might have been at fault, but it took courage like no other to do so, and in that moment proved to us that Usopp is braver and more capable than he often believes himself to be. Being a storyteller and a tinkerer, Usopp is extremely creative and tactical. In addition to his melee repairs, Usopp also created Nami's weapon, the Climattact. He was also able to take all the dials he collected from Skypiea to enhance the Climattact and created a new weapon for himself, Kabuto. Usopp also fashioned diving suits for the crew to explore the wreckage of the ship that fell from a sky island. Usopp also created a special grappling hook that helped them get back to their boat in the upper yard in Skypiea, as well as special suction cup shoes to help them board Enel's Arc Maxim to save Nami. He was able to put all of these talents to use in his battle with Luffy, giving him the upper hand for the majority of that fight. In Enies lobby, despite having left the crew, Usopp was a huge help in saving Robin. He's extremely charismatic, a trait shared with Luffy, and so was able to gain the admiration and support from the giants who initially were their enemies. When Usopp lost his fight against Jabra, he was saved at the last minute by Sanji, another bruise to his already severely damaged ego. But before he could fully start beating himself up about it, Sanji, someone who also suffers with self-worth issues, says to him, "Everyone has things that they can and cannot do. I'll do the things that you can't do, and you can do what I can't do." This moment allows Usopp to get out of his head to really recontextualize his value to the crew, which ultimately leads to him saving Robin at the last minute from being taken away. Usopp is capable, he always has been, but he continues to judge himself on an unfair scale. He lacks confidence and so leads with that lack of confidence. It is mostly when he is pushed to the point of desperation or into a corner with no one else to help him out, that's when he's able to reach within to find the strength and confidence to tackle things head on. Taking all of these things into consideration, at some point we have to face the truth. The reason why most of us hate Usopp is because we are Usopp. We have dreams that sometimes we're afraid to go out there to take the risk to accomplish. We love feeling safe. We prefer to take the easy way out, and because of that path, we often feel like we're lagging behind everyone else. The difference between Usopp and us, though, is that Usopp, regardless of his fears, still tries, and he becomes stronger and more capable every day because of it. We tend to compare Usopp to his crewmates and everyone else because of how fantastical the One Piece world as a whole is, instead of comparing him to early versions of himself and the sheltered world he grew up in. Similarly, we tend to look at the success of others, not fully realizing how different their stories are, not fully taking into consideration where they started, where they've been, and how they got there, and only think about the fact that we're not there ourselves. In reality, all of our journeys are different, and as long as we're out here trying and putting our best foot forward, we are on the same path to becoming the best versions of ourselves. Usopp might not only be closer to fulfilling his personal goal of becoming a brave warrior, but one might say he has already become exactly what he's trying to be. Bravery is the ability to do all of the things that we have to or want to do despite our fears of a negative outcome. He isn't a coward because he tries, and when he fails, despite it all, he gets back up and tries again.